Hello there, my name is Sixo, but more on that later as I simply have to talk about these adorable toys. Yes, hot off the heels of Missing Link Convoy, we now have our first official look at TakaraTomy's C-03 Bumblebee and C-04 Cliffjumper, the next two classic 1980s Transformers to be given a modern, super articulated makeover. Now I'm tremendously excited for these, especially as the originals are some of my absolute favourites of the era. So let's dive on in and count down everything there is to know about these terrifically tiny toys. Before we begin, this video is brought to you by TF Source, so you'll find a link to their site in the description below. Number 8. Their reproductions. This first point might sound obvious to those in the know, but these toys are almost exact recreations of the same designs that first debuted as Transformers in 1984, except built from the ground up with lots more articulation and joints factored in. Now to be clear, they're not reuses of those molds at all, as they have wholly new tooling, despite an obvious attempt to have them look and feel as close to the originals as possible. The classic designs started life under TakaraTomy's own microchange line in 1983, and were two of the 7 mini-car robo-toys, each being released in yellow, red and blue. They were licensed by Hasbro to become Bumblebee and Cliffjumper just a year later, now sporting Autobot logos on their chests, although these were in turn replaced by rub signs for the 1985 re-releases. As with Optimus, the new toys copy the style of these vintage specimens to a T, meaning Bumblebee comes with his original faceplated head and not the more cartoon-styled version found on later reissues of the figure. I've seen a few people saying they would have preferred something a little more in keeping with the cartoon here, but after decades of new designs all attempting to recreate the animation to ever greater degrees, I can't help but be glad that's simply not what this line is all about. Missing Link? More like missing the point, I think. Number 7. The vehicle modes. Much has been made of Bumblebee and Cliffjumper's squished vehicle proportions over the years, especially after the style was kept for the corresponding cartoon. However, it's surely no surprise to see Missing Link aping the originals in this regard. Again, it all goes back to Microchange, which was a line of transforming robots that turned into everyday household objects, including the likes of cassette players, microscopes, and guns. By the same logic, the mini-car robo releases were intended as toys of toy cars, as opposed to toys recreating full-size cars, and came crafted in the style of TakaraTomy's own Koro Q line from 1979, which had been sold in the West as penny racers. This explains their chibi super deformed style, although they're still ultimately based on real-world cars, including a Volkswagen Beetle and a Porsche 924 Turbo, which is enough to earn at least Bumblebee a licensed vehicle mode in this case. Once again, the new toys look to be an almost one-to-one reproduction of the originals in just about every regard, and it's fair to say they're as cute as buttons. Number 6. New articulation. Of course, where Missing Link toys majorly differ to the vintage specimens is the articulation. For starters, their heads can now turn, and the arms appear to have an additional outward joint at the shoulder and a hinge for elbow movement, versus the original's ability to simply rotate at one point. Next, you can twist the wrists, which also means the front wheels move with the hands to a new orientation, sitting at 90 degrees to the arm. There's a lot more movement in the legs too, with an outward joint at the hips, a thigh swivel and a knee bend positioned just above the feet, which is a really clever solution considering the inherent design, and is a far cry from the statically positioned legs found on the originals. All in, these updates really do look like the classic toys got up and decided to move about, which is exactly what many of us always wanted. They're even able to recreate their original box art to a surprisingly close degree. Number 5. Materials. Now, one aspect collectors still love about the early days of Transformers toys is the materials used in production. They're famed for their rubber tires, plentiful chrome highlights, and generous use of die-cast metal, all of which helps to give them a distinct premium feel. Naturally, no recreation of these originals would be quite the same without such flourishes, so it was a welcome surprise to see them intact on Missing Link Optimus, and it appears we can expect the same for Bumblebee and Cliffjumper. That means we can look forward to chrome on areas such as the panel behind the head and the wheel hubcaps, as well as rubber tires. There will also likely be die-cast present in the main body, meaning these new toys should be a true treat to sample up close. Number 4. Scale. Considering their status as mini-bots, one element of these toys which should be expected is their small stature, although quite how teeny tiny they are may still be a surprise for some. Essentially conceived as small pocket money toys back in the day, the new updates keep that element intact by recreating the designs in 1-to-1 scale, meaning you could conceivably mistake them for those same vintage releases on a cursory glance. To me, it's a large part of what makes Missing Link figures so successful, allowing them to exist as almost perfected versions of the toys as they were. It also means Bumblebee and Cliffjumper will be smaller than a modern core class release, although arguably even more adorable somehow. Number 3. Accessories. Where the classic toys came armed with nothing but their wits and a decent dose of charm, the modern overhauls are now sporting some rather attractive accessories. Bumblebee is equipped with a small blaster that can peg into either hand, and looks to be a decent approximation of his weapon from the cartoon. Meanwhile, Cliff comes with 2 separate firearms, the first again being a fairly faithful take on his animation style handheld handgun, whilst the second represents the much larger rifle he is seen using in the cartoon's pilot episode. These pieces are welcome additions to both releases, especially as they've been trussed up in the classic chrome style of the 80s, making them feel almost like they were always meant to be present somehow. Number 2. Repaints. The classic minibots were released in an unprecedented number of varying colour schemes, and although many of them seem like unlikely candidates for a Missing Link release, there are a few ideas which would be great fun to see. Firstly, some of Cliffjumper's most famous repaints are his 2003 Black Keychain release, or even the toy's 2002 Botcon makeover as the separate character of Tap Out. There are also various Argentinian recolours from the 80s, released under license by a toy company known as Antex. And of course there was Hasbro and Takara's own retool of the mould into Hubcap for their 1986 roster, which would be a welcome if somewhat unlikely surprise for Missing Link. Meanwhile, Bumblebee was overhauled with a sparkling new gold makeover for his 1993 Generation 2 debut, as well as getting the black keychain treatment in 2003, and a similarly styled Botcon repaint in 2002 for the new character of Glyph. There's also the 2004 eHobby release that reimagined the toy as the classic GoBots character of Bugbite, to say nothing of the various South American releases or even the inspiration of the original Microchange Blue for both toys. Although that would really just make me want the Microchange Mazda mold recreated too, as the idea of a Missing Link bumper would certainly be fun to see, no matter how unlikely that might be. Finally, it would be great fun to see the two Missing Link releases given an old school colour swap, to homage how their vintage counterparts were originally released in both red and yellow. That seems like the most likely option somehow. Number 1. The price. There's been so much discourse about the price of these things since they were unveiled, to the point where it's largely overshadowed much of the excitement of the reveal itself. The Japanese RRP is 5,940 yen each, which roughly shakes out at about $38 before shipping. Now, many were quick to point out that that's a fair chunk of change for redesigns of old pocket money toys from some 40 years ago, and stacks up as a little pricey when you consider the asking price of your average Generations Deluxe or Core Class figures. The thing is, we have no way of knowing the size of the production runs of these comparatively small appeal collector-orientated figures versus your typical mainline mass-produced prominent retail fare. Similarly, this being a Takara-only project likely means there's no cost splitting with Hasbro on the investment side, not to mention the inclusion of chrome, die-cast and rubber tyres, as we've talked about. Ultimately, it is true they sit on the more expensive side of how I imagine such toys being priced, yet I have to say I wasn't sat there mouth agape stunned rigid by it all either. I guess maybe when compared to other rather exorbitant toys that are up for pre-order currently, and just the general overpriced state of everything right now, it's hard to feel too strongly that this pair of tiny toys is the real capitalism tipping point somehow. That said, I understand where people are coming from, and I suppose we'll just have to hope that the figures themselves more than justify the asking price once they're in hand. Although based on everything we've seen so far, it feels likely they should be a bit of a hit, and I know for my part I definitely won't be missing out on what is quite literally a dream come true. Now, today's video is brought to you by TF Source, so I'll throw a link to their site in the description below where you can check them out for all your Transformers and third-party needs. And if you've enjoyed this video, then there are also links to the various ways that you can support me, which makes all the difference in terms of keeping the channel running. Finally, I'd love it if you could drop me a like for today's effort, please, and don't forget to let me know your thoughts on these toys. Are you excited for the Missing Link mini-bots, or not so sure? Otherwise, that's it from me, so thanks for watching and have a great rest of your day. TTFN.